Hello, my name's Kate Redshaw and I'm a senior lawyer in the employment team at Burgess Salmon. I'm joined again today by one of our partners, Luke Bowery. Hi, good to see you, Luke. Now, Luke, if you'd said to me 12 months ago we'd be doing a conversation about flexible working, I might have queried that. The right for employees to request to change their hours of work or their place of work has been around for a long time now. And, you know, most employers generally found it very easy to get on with, and it didn't used to cause much cause for concern. But of course, as with so many things, COVID-19 has changed all of that, because so very many people have been essentially working flexibly since March, working from home or perhaps working different hours because of childcare arrangements. And of course, people are beginning to think, actually, I really like this new arrangement and I'd like to look to make it permanent. And equally, employers are looking at how they want to work with workforces moving forwards with office space and so on. So I think requests for people to work flexibly are now going to be coming in thick and fast. So Luke, I've got a number of scenarios I'd like to pick your brains about, if that's all right. You know, I think we want to talk about employers who are going to face a deluge of requests to work flexibly, potentially. How, you know, issues around the reasons for request. You have to start to kind of put one employee's reasons for working flexibly above somebody else's. And also just some practical issues for employers around what to do if they don't really yet know how their workplace and working arrangements are going to be, say, 12 months from now. But I think let's just start with a step back, because of course, whilst people are always actually free to make informal requests of employers to change their hours or place of work, there is of course a statutory right allowing them to do so. And perhaps, Luke, we could start with you just telling us a little bit more about how that right operates.
Yep. Hi, Kate. You're right. Any employee with 26 weeks or more service can ask their employer for a permanent change, contractual change to their place of work, the hours they work or the pattern of hours they work. Under regulations, there is a formal process they have to follow. So the request has to be in writing and so on. And the employer has 3 months to consider and respond to the request, but that includes hearing any appeal. The employer, of course, doesn't have to agree to the request, but if it doesn't do so, it needs to be for one of 8 specified business reasons set out in the regulations.
Okay, so 8 reasons that are set out. That sounds like it's potentially quite narrow, but I think, Luke, those reasons are pretty wide-ranging, actually, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. Under the regulations, they're pretty all-encompassing. So they include additional burden of cost, detrimental impact on quality and performance, inability to reallocate work amongst the rest of the workforce, and also planned structural changes to the business. So pretty wide, you're right.
Okay, so that's a helpful overview of that legal right. And actually, if people want to know more about how that right operates, I suggest you have a look at the ACAS website. ACAS have got a statutory code of practice on flexible working, and there's also a guidance note on flexible working on that website as well, which is very useful. But I'd like now, Luke, to look at flexible working through a COVID-related lens, if I may, because there's a number of scenarios which I think arise. And the first one I'd like to look at is what happens if you've got a super switched on, super sharp employee who thinks, actually, I'm rather enjoying working from home. I'm aware that this statutory right exists. I'm going to get in early, put my request in to change my place of work, say, and my employer is going to have to accept it because I'm first in. What's the position there?
Well, I think strictly speaking, if the employee makes the request and the employer doesn't follow due process, in theory, that employee can actually bring an employment tribunal claim. The stakes aren't particularly high in relation to a breach of the regulations. I think it's £4,304 maximum award at the moment, but employers aren't really going to want to be faced with that. And perhaps more importantly, we'll come on to this, there is the risk of discrimination-related claims for employers who don't properly consider flexible working requests. I think it's also worth pointing out, I guess, that there is an obligation on the employer to deal with all requests in a reasonable manner. And the ACAS code you refer to, I think, does say that requests should be dealt with in the order in which they're received. So just put it in your drawer and ignoring it or saying I'll deal with it when the other requests come in, probably not the best strategy. If there are formal requests made under regulations, you're going to have to deal with them in 3 months unless you can agree with the employee an extension of that period of time. And if you've got, not expecting a swathe of requests, then that may not be an issue, of course.
Yeah, I suppose that's a good point. If you're just expecting one or two, you may as well just deal with that as on an as and when basis. But with that eager beaver, if you're expecting a lot of requests to come in and people perhaps have held off for now just because the status quo is continuing, do you have any tips about how you might manage that request? Because it just seems that first come first serve seems a little bit, off potentially.
Yeah, it makes me uncomfortable. I mean, I think a practical and fair way to probably deal with it is try and get in with a bit of a preemptive strike, perhaps. So, many employers have successfully transitioned to home working over the last 6 months, and I expect most of them are already planning what their workplaces are going to look like over the next 1 or 2 years, particularly as COVID, as we know, isn't going anywhere fast. So I guess my advice would be, as far as you can, would be to start working out what your new normal plans might look like and start communicating those with staff sooner rather than later, even if they are in embryonic form. And there have been a number of examples in the press. So if, for example, you kind of made a decision in your own minds that you are going to allow more home working post-COVID, then you might start thinking how you communicate that with employees, even if you're saying you're going to be fleshing out the detail at a later date when you've done more thinking around it. At a practical level, you'd hope that that might appease many employees. They'll be happy as they are. They might not even make the formal requests. If they do, probably puts you in a better chance to try and agree an extension of time to the 3-month period, which we discussed, because of what you're talking about, or even potentially to turn down the request for one of the 8 business reasons, namely planned structural changes in the business. You've talked about it. You might say, well, look, at the current time, because of that, we're not in a position to be able to agree to your request.
Yeah, that's a good point, particularly if you can say we're looking at it actively as to what we might do in the future. Okay, let's look at a different scenario now, if we might, and one which I think is going to be really common, and that is this influx of requests. In fact, you might even, as following on from what you're saying about devising a kind of strategy at this point, you might even be asking people to put in requests by a certain date so that you can actively consider them as a whole rather than on a one-by-one basis. There's all sorts of potentially difficult issues around whose request to allow and whose might have to get turned down or tweaked. But I think, Luke, before we even get to that, and I do want to get to that, can an employer turn down an employee's request, say, to work from home, if that employee can say, well, for the last 6 months I've been working from home, why on earth wouldn't you allow me to continue?
Yeah, I think that will be a common question. And I think you're right. At a basic level, an employee who's worked very successfully at home for 6 months or so is going to be in a much stronger position to say, why can't I maintain that status quo? I don't necessarily think that's a slam dunk. So if you take a step back, the lockdown situation was really unique, that everyone who could work from home was working from home. So the decision-making process was a bit easier. I think once you start to think about a hybrid model between office working and home working, the issues become a bit more nuanced. So there will be more focus on how you properly allocate work, how you make your teams interact most effectively, how you manage and prioritise your office space. And as you've mentioned, we know that's a massive separate issue. And also how you might manage your junior employees so they get sufficient supervision, learning opportunities, mentoring, etc. And that might have an impact both on your required attendance for junior and senior employees. I think once you go back to that hybrid model, there are a number of more complicated issues, which it's not as simple as saying one person or one employee has worked successfully on their own for 6 months at home.
Yeah, no, I can see that. So, I mean, I guess the only caveat to that, I suppose, is what we touched on before, which is you need to be careful around discrimination, don't you, in the reasons why the employee has put in the request that they have. I mean, let's go back to that initial question, though, that I asked, Luke, which is around how you manage an influx of requests. Now, I think the ACAS guidance around this is that, you can just do it on a kind of random basis, pick names out of a hat, which doesn't sound hugely appealing to me, Luke. But I mean, I suppose in the first instance, what you're trying to do is you're going to look at the requests and see which ones at the off you can just agree to. But what do you do after that?
Yeah, hats definitely to be avoided in my view, if at all possible. I think you're right. You want to funnel your requests, from easy to hard, and I think one way of doing that is, as we discussed, being preemptive and proactive as to work out what you think your new normal might look like. So if you're starting to communicate that you're going to require a de minimis number of days in the office or core hours where everyone must be available, those sorts of things, if you're starting to get those messages out, you'd like to think that any formal requests which come in might have those or be based or thinking about those parameters in mind, which may in turn make it easier just to agree to a larger number of them. So that's one thing. I think you are right, again, to flag the discrimination point, potentially in terms of priority. I think the ACAS code does actually say that you don't need to prioritise requests from carers or parents, but given the indirect sex discrimination risks and other discrimination claims, religion, belief, reasonable adjustment-based claims, I think those sorts of requests are inevitably going to probably be given some priority, and I think rightly so.
Yeah, but you make a good point there about trying to agree as many requests as you can, because actually, although clearly at the moment the jobs market is very difficult, the jobs market will recover in time, it will become more buoyant, and we will see flexibility out there in terms of how people can work like we've never seen before. So if you want to hang on to your good people and they're asking to work in a particular way now, it would clearly be sensible to see what you can agree to if you want to hang on to them, moving forwards. But, I'd like to go back to this issue of incompatible requests and how how as an employer, when you've got those things that you just know won't work, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, well, I think another staging post would be, and I think the ACAS code recommends this as well, is to get the relevant employees together, discuss their requests, and see what compromise or flex there might be. In my experience, if that has worked effectively, it does lead to a better longer term solution because the employees feel invested in the decision making process, and perhaps they may be able to better understand the issues and challenges their colleagues are facing.
Yeah.
So I think that's certainly one thing to try and reduce those number of difficult requests or competing requests you've got to deal with.
But do you think you ultimately, so I'm pushing you on this point just because I think it will inevitably arise. You're happy to be pushed on the point. But, if you've got, say, somebody saying, I need this pattern of work, or I need to be at home because of say childcare reasons, and you've got somebody else saying I really don't like the long commute that I've got. Do you think ultimately you are, as the employer, going to be having to make these value judgments?
The answer is yes. I think the key point is to try and reduce the number of value judgments you've got to make to an absolute minimum, and then be based on transparent, clear reasons if you are having to prioritise some requests over others. But I'd say the take home would be that you don't put yourself in that position as much, or you reduce that as little as possible.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I suppose you can always have trial periods, can't you? And again, that's another way of making people feel that at least you've given it a go. I suppose something else I'd like to just mention, actually, Luke, which will be, involves all of this, is actually, where does this sit? I mean, you'll have, I guess what I'm thinking of is are you in danger of having line managers kind of allowing different practices?
Yeah, good point. We're discussing this today on the basis we think we may get, or employers may get, a number of requests across a number of different departments all in a short space of time. So you certainly want to put in place a central structure, probably through HR, where you're dealing with each request in a transparent, consistent, clear way. You certainly don't want different line managers dealing with the requests in different ways. Yeah, definitely agree with that, to be avoided.
Yeah, so you just want that overarching governance, even if there are different practices in different parts of the business where that's justified. And I suppose, a point which actually we're not going to have time to go into today, but I just want to flag, I think we might have a separate conversation about this, is actually, ultimately, if you've had a trial period and you've all gone, yes, this is great, it works, it's going to lead to permanent changes to the contract of employment. But it's not just as simple, is it? It's just updating the place of work or the hours of work. I mean, there's quite a lot more to it than that. And I think, some of it's going to be some quite difficult decisions, isn't it, around pay and benefits potentially.
Yeah, I think you're right. A different conversation, but the example of someone in the city not having to commute in, etc. Then part of the bargain may well be a consideration of what allowances are still appropriate. Is the city premium pay appropriate? So there is lots of thinking to be done in the round, particularly, as I say, if you're going to be looking at multiple requests, you have to think about and maybe approve.
Yeah. Well, Luke, I think that's more or less all we've got time for. What I would like to flag, though, is do you remember there was a general election back in December? I don't know about you, but I've almost forgotten that. That seems like a lifetime ago. But actually, following that, in the Queen's speech, the government announced that there would be an employment bill, and in that there was the suggestion that they might look to change things so that all jobs are flexible unless an employer has a good reason for that job not to be. Now, there was really very little detail about that, and I think it was going to be certainly subject to consultation, but it's probably something to watch for in the future, because there may be changes around that right to request flexible working in due course. So I think, taking everything that you've said, Luke, together, as ever with employment law issues, I think what we're saying is open and timely communication and engagement with employees on this issue is going to be really very important. And actually, if you can identify, even if it's only a short-term strategy at this point, but also a longer-term strategy in due course as to how you're going to approach flexible working, that can only be a good thing in terms of making your lives easier actually to manage when these flexible working requests start to roll in. It may be that you have to look to make some changes to your flexible working policy. So if we can help you with that at all, we'd be delighted to do so. Equally, if you've got any issues around changing contracts of employment or some of the discrimination issues that we've touched on, we'd obviously be happy to help. We've got lots of resources for employers on the Burgess Salmon website, both about managing flexible working, but also wider issues around the furlough scheme, what to pay when people are off work, and so on. So please do take a look at the website. Thank you for watching.